the flaps to 15 degrees at the direction of the pilot. Airspeed is reduced and maintained at 85 knots on base leg. Nearing the final approach course, the pilot calls for 30 or 40 degree flaps and turns to final. On this approach, the pilot calls for 40 degrees. Now complete the before landing checklist. The prop lever should be moved to full increase RPM position. The hydraulic pressure is checked normal and the gear is rechecked down. On final approach, slow the aircraft to the short field threshold speed. This speed is normally established at a point 1/4 mile from the end of the runway. Use pitch control to maintain airspeed, adjusting throttles as required to maintain the glide path. A 400 to 700 feet per minute rate of descent should be flown, and the touchdown should be from 100 to 200 feet from the end of the runway markings. On this approach, the pilot aims for the touchdown area on a landing zone outlined by marking panels. Just before touchdown, slowly close the throttles to idle and apply a smooth, continuous back pressure to the yoke. Don't be surprised if you feel the light stick shaker. As the main gear touches down, move throttles into reverse thrust range and apply intermittent braking to stop the aircraft. Before dust and debris are blown forward of the engines, bring the throttles out of reverse range. A variable pattern entry can be any type except a standard approach and is designed to place you outside hostile ground fire or friendly artillery range. Here is an overhead approach. Enemy ground fire on one side, friendly artillery on the other. Deny a normal traffic pattern. Initiate the descent and before landing checks before reaching the approach end of the runway. Over the touchdown point, maintain an altitude of 1,500 feet or higher, depending on the circumstances, and airspeed of 110 to 120 knots. Now bank approximately 30 degrees right or left and retard power as required. After turning 180 degrees, roll wings level to lower landing gear and set flaps for landing. Continue turn toward the runway, adjusting power to maintain a safe airspeed for the flap settings. Either a short field or normal landing may be executed. Here is another example, the modified straight-in approach. Because of the tactical situation on the ground, a 360-degree approach is inadvisable. Enemy and friendly forces may border the airfield on 3 sides. A modified straight-in approach is the only way in. Terrain, weather, and the combat situation will dictate the altitude and exact heading to the field. Select gear and flaps a sufficient distance from the field to ensure a safe approach and landing. You have seen 2, but there are many other types of variable pattern entries. A variable pattern entry under certain conditions will enhance the chances of a successful mission and survival of crew and aircraft. On a short field takeoff, accomplish the before takeoff check. The flaps are set to 25 degrees. Center the nose wheel and hold the brakes while accomplishing the line-up checklist. When the checklist is completed, prepare for takeoff. Advance the throttles to max power. Check and stabilize the engine instruments. On a slippery or sandy runway, it is best to release the brakes before obtaining max power to minimize danger of equipment damage from blowing sand or gravel or skidding of the aircraft. Maintain directional control by nose wheel steering and differential power if necessary. Steering can be assured if the co-pilot holds the control column slightly forward of neutral. Keep the wings level with the ailerons. When rudder control becomes fully effective, but never below 55 knots, discontinue nose wheel steering and transition to the yoke, moving it aft of neutral. Then rotate the aircraft to make sure the nose gear lifts off before the main gear. Liftoff speed is 55 to 64 knots, depending on the gross takeoff weight. When at a safe altitude, retract gear and flaps simultaneously. Don't rotate the aircraft to an angle that will cause a drop in airspeed and result in stall. If necessary, fly 360-degree spirals to a safe altitude above ground fire. If no airstrip exists, or it is under enemy fire, a personnel drop may be the only way to reinforce a Special Forces camp. A briefing by the aircraft commander precedes the mission. He reports the altitude they will fly to the drop area, the weather they will encounter, in-flight and emergency procedures to observe. Inside, the flight engineer has prepared the aircraft for the para-drop. He has checked the anchor line for security. He makes sure the static line retriever is operational. Now the aircraft is ready for the troopers. Flying to the drop zone, the aircrew, pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer conduct a series of checks. The first check takes only a moment.
Co-pilot engineer, this is the 20-minute warning.
20-minute warning acknowledged. Twenty-minute warning complete.
Next, the 10-minute warning check. After the co-pilot transmits the warning to the crew, the flight engineer notifies the jump master. The pilot and co-pilot review the final checkpoints to the drop zone and the altitude at the release point. As the aircraft approaches closer to the release point, the co-pilot transmits the 6-minute warning to the flight engineer and activates the red caution light.
6-minute warning acknowledged. 6 minutes. 6 minutes. 6 minutes.
After notifying the jump master, the flight engineer activates the cargo door and ramp switches. From now on, activity will be continuous until the signal to jump is given. In the cockpit, the co-pilot receives last-minute instructions from the combat control team on the ground. The controllers give conditions on the drop zone, such as wind velocity and direction, also any condition that could affect the jump. The pilot now takes the aircraft to drop altitude while reducing airspeed to 110 knots, the normal drop speed. In the cargo compartment, the flight engineer ensures the cargo ramp is set at 15 degrees below horizontal. Troopers hook static lines to the anchor line cables.
Hook up! Start your equipment check.
Following the buddy system, they check each other's lines, parachutes, and drop equipment. As an additional safety measure, the flight engineer double-checks the drop equipment. And the jump master, who is one of the jump team, double-checks the equipment of the troopers. 1 minute away from the release point, the co-pilot transmits the 1-minute warning.
Co-pilot engineer, 1-minute warning.
The pilot stabilizes the airspeed at 110 knots and establishes the drop altitude. On the ground, the combat control team radios the final heading to the aircraft to assure proper positioning over the drop zone and calls the release point. The co-pilot hits the green light switch and it's go. One second prior to expiration of the usable DZ length, the co-pilot activates the red caution light. The flight engineer retrieves the static lines and closes the cargo ramp, and the pilot regains normal speed and altitude for the trip home. An alternate delivery method when air-land operations are not suitable and a landing strip is not available is the gravity airdrop. The flight engineer who helps load the aircraft is responsible for the cargo from tie-down to release. He must see that the cargo is secure and check the drop equipment, the manual release device, the static line, the center anchor line cable, and associated safety chains and tie-down straps. Following a briefing by the operations officer, the crew and aircraft take off. En route to the drop zone, the 20 and 10-minute warning checks are performed. The pilot and co-pilot review the final checkpoints en route to the drop zone, the altitude and airspeed for the execution of the drop. Then comes the 6-minute check, which is completed at least 1,500 feet above ground level.
Co-pilot to engineer. This is a 6-minute warning.
The co-pilot transmits the 6-minute warning and turns on the red caution light. The flight engineer acknowledges the 6-minute warning and checks the red caution light is on. He then starts to prepare the load for the drop. He removes straps and tie-downs. Meanwhile, ground personnel who are awaiting the drop report drop zone conditions. If a combat control team is not on the ground, the pilots determine the release point.